It is official. Carlos Beltran is out as the New York Mets manager. In a statement released by the New York Mets, we met with Carlos last night and again this morning and agreed to mutually part ways. This was not an easy decision considering the circumstances. It became clear to all parties that it was not in anyone's best interest for Carlos to move forward as manager of the New York Mets. We believe that Carlos was honest and forthcoming with us. We are confident that this will not be the final chapter in his baseball career. We remain excited about the talent on this team and are committed to reaching our goals of winning now and in the future. And this is moving pretty quickly because it was a half hour after the Mets had basically named a street in Port St. Lucie after Mike Piazza. They're now reporting that they're looking at Luis Rojas to be the replacement manager. There's so much to dissect in this story, but I think one of the first thoughts that many Met fans thought was, well, if we hire Joe Girardi, this wouldn't even be an issue. And I'll be honest, that was one of my first thoughts when this story broke today. And this has been ongoing. There's a lot of things with this story. Personally, I think the Mets, the reason that they wanted to move away from this was to get away from the distraction. They didn't want this to be hovering over the team, especially because you saw how Houston, this is going to hang over them all season, but they've made moves in their front office to get rid of people and fire them. The Red Sox have done the same thing with Alex Cora, and I don't think the Mets wanted to have that distraction of Carlos Beltran around the team. I also think this, too, because if you read that statement that he was honest and forthcoming, and two things stick out to me with that. Either the Mets feel that he's hiding something potentially, or he told them the extent of what he was involved, and maybe the Mets, then they're letting on. But a couple of my thoughts about how the Mets handled this. First thing is, and this should be a little bit alarming for Mets fans, is maybe they weren't fully sold on Carlos Beltran as a manager. Because if you were fully convinced that this was the guy, and you really felt that he was the guy that put you over the top as the manager, I think they would have fought a lot harder for him. But they didn't. That also could lead to, do they think that there's more to the story? Do they think more could potentially come out and he could be suspended? That's another thing, too, and that could be part of it. I mean, I think that this can be a continuing situation. We're not, I think, going to be fully resolved for a long time. We won't know all the answers to this. And I don't think the Mets want to play that game. I think that they wanted to get out in front of this, give them some time before spring training to make a move and not have this drag on into the season. So I get both sides of it. And I get people are critical of the Mets because they're moving off of Beltran because of this, because there hasn't been an official punishment yet. But you get the feeling with the Alex Cora comments that Beltran had a bigger role. And even though he was a player, and I don't think there will be any players, I could be wrong, but I don't think any players involved that are actively playing will be punished. But it is something to say, like, with Beltran, he's no longer playing. Could MLB have made an example? Because baseball has made it clear they are punishing everyone involved in the scale that they can because they don't want this to happen. They know this is a problem, and basically because Manfred set out mandates in 2017, 2018. Don't use technology. You cannot use technology to cheat. And this team blatantly was doing that. So I do think Manfred's coming down hard to say, hey, if your organization is going to try to do something like this and you get caught, there will be major repercussions. And for the Mets and the Met fans, I can understand the frustration today because there was already frustration because most Met fans wanted Joe Girardi for this team. And one of the big things we got from the initial Beltran press conference from Brodie Van Wagenen was how Beltran seemed that he was going to collaborate with him, which to every Met fan, including myself, basically said Brodie wanted someone he could control. But a lot of things have also happened with the Mets in the coming months since Beltran's been hired. The biggest of which is they're going to have new ownership. Over the next 5 years, the Wilpons are going to sell the team. So I do think that part of this decision could be coming all the way up from the top because even though the sale hasn't officially gone through yet, I do think that the Mets and the ownership group understands that they're moving forward. They're moving in a new direction. And with Beltran, they didn't want this to be hovering over them. And I think that they're looking at the risk and reward. Because if Beltran gets caught, that's going to hurt the Mets. And here's the other thing, too, with this whole scandal and with Beltran leaving. Managers in baseball aren't necessarily valuable. If you have a great manager, he's valuable. But for the most part, unless you have one of the top 3 or 4 managers in baseball, there really isn't much of a difference. I mean, once you get past the great coaches in this sport, there's a big drop-off. And you look the way the game has evolved with analytics, a lot of these managers, they're taking cues from the front office anyways. So because you lose a manager isn't a crippling blow. I don't think it's a crippling blow to this team, especially because you look at how the game's evolving. Coaching isn't crucial in the NFL. It's crucial in college football. If you don't have a good head coach in the NFL, you're not going anywhere. If you don't have a good coach in college football and a good recruiter, you're not going anywhere. Baseball, you can get away with it. And even though, like I've said this before, the Met fan wanted Joe Girardi, and I understand that. It seemed too perfect of a fit. And I understand the frustration that he went to Philadelphia. But for the time being now, this was the move the Mets had to make because they understood if they kept Beltran and something came out, they were going to get blasted by the media. Because don't forget, the media, it's very easy to pick on the Mets. It's very easy to pick on the Wilpons. And especially because they passed on Joe Girardi, I think a lot of people within the media are ready to just rip the Mets, especially for Beltran, especially now that this is coming out and if it is found that he is more guilty than we know. Because Cora didn't completely out him, but you could tell Cora's saying, there's more to Beltran than you know. And I think that's what's terrifying the Mets is because Beltran can say the right things to you. And maybe he even told you everything. But if you're the Mets, and even if you don't know the truth, or even if you do know the truth, if that truth gets out, and it's worse than it is now, it could impact this franchise. And they didn't want that distraction. The worst thing you can have in sports is a distraction. You cannot win with distractions. And the Mets just basically said, we don't want to deal with this distraction. We cannot deal with it. And especially when you look for a first-time manager, where this was going to be his first-time job. And it also tells me about the Mets. Do they really believe in Beltran? If they felt that this really was the guy that's going to manage this team long-term and be a pivotal piece of this puzzle next year, do you think they would have fought harder for him? Let me ask you this. For Beltran, I know there's never a perfect example for this, but when you're accused of a crime or if you're accused of doing something wrong and you know that you are completely 100% innocent, that the evidence will be behind you, you fight tooth and nail to prove your innocence. It's when I kind of did that you try to, walk around it or try to hide it or try to be quiet, which is really what Beltran has been doing. I mean, he hasn't come out and said, these allegations are crazy, I had no involvement. And look, there are people that come out and say that to be proven wrong. But it is concerning to me where this has been swirling for the last 2 months and you really haven't heard from Beltran. And Beltran's been pretty quiet. And I understand that's his demeanor. But when someone's calling out your character and your integrity, wouldn't you fight hard to protect that? So for the Mets, I have to give them credit because I know I've been hearing this on the sport talk radio shows that the Mets, they're killing the team because they're letting him go and that they should keep him. But to me, there's no harm really. I mean, he's a first-time manager that's reporting to Brody, and we all know that the front office is going to have a more hands-on approach with how the game-to-game operations are going to be. But we're talking about a guy that doesn't have a track record. We're talking about a guy that doesn't have any pelts on the wall as a manager. If this was a manager that had success and a proven track record, so really, what are the Mets losing by letting him go? They're doing it before training camp. If they've done this midway through training camp or 10 days in the regular season, yeah, I would say that would be a bad move. But right now, they're getting ahead of it, and they understand that this scandal, and they see how Major League Baseball is reacting. They are not playing around with this. They are looking to come down hard. And if the Mets feel they're going to come down hard on Beltran, they're better off to get in front of this. And like I said, in baseball, the manager isn't as valuable as in other sports. You can have a valuable manager like a Joe Girardi, but where the Mets are right now, I don't think you're going to be hurt with bringing in another guy. I don't think it's going to kill this franchise potentially this year. Is it unfortunate the timing? Yes. Could Beltran have been a great manager? Absolutely. But for all the pros and the cons with this, the reasons for getting rid of Beltran now outweigh anything on the field. They just do. It just makes too much sense. There's too much baggage with Beltran. And it's unfortunate because he was a great player, but now we're going to look back at his career with an asterisk saying, man, what was his involvement? Was everything he did he get an advantage? I mean, we always talk about one of the great things people said about Beltran was how great at reading the pitchers he was. But now when you say that, and I feel a couple people already smirking, people are going to be like, well, I mean, maybe he had a little help reading the pitchers. So that's the big story. The Mets, once again, have relieved Carlos Beltran of his duties, saying that they've mutually parted ways. This was rumored yesterday that this was going to happen, and it finally broke today. And I think the Mets did the right thing. I killed the Mets a lot for some of the moves. For anyone that's listened to me, they know I'm not a big fan of Brodie Van Wagenen. I think he's been a terrible general manager, and I don't think he's long for this world with the Mets. And I wasn't a fan of not hiring Joe Girardi. But I think they did the right thing here, and really the only thing they could do. I mean, I just think that the distractions, if more information came out, would outweigh any positive he would have on this team this year. So I have to give the Mets credit where credit is due. And I think this was the right decision. And if they really, truly believed that he was the manager, like they needed to have him, I think they would have fought harder for him. But it tells you they view him as more expendable. They're like, he could be a good manager, but with all this distractions and all this baggage, it's just not worth it. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss any of our latest content. Of course, now we'll be updating you with all the latest on the Mets' new managerial search as that comes around. And, of course, we'll preview the season once we get into pitchers and catchers. But until next time, I'm your host, Nolan Rich. Thank you so much for joining us here and joining us on Rich Sports Talk.